November 12, 1942, 3:27 in the afternoon. Richmond, California. The strangest sound on the waterfront was not steel. It was applause. A full-sized ocean cargo ship, raw gray and ugly as a warehouse, slid down the ways while stopwatches were still warm in men's palms. She had existed for only 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes from keel laying to launch. Her name was Robert E. Peary. Her hull still smelled less like the sea than like scorched primer, wet timber, hot cable insulation, and champagne running over paint that had barely begun to dry. Out, in the yard, crane hooks were already swinging back for the next sections. There was no reverence in it, no cathedral silence, no sense that a ship ought to take a season, or a year, or the careful pride of a narrow guild. She went into the water like a thing that had been stamped out. Across the Pacific, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had built his naval war on a different clock. The Imperial Japanese Navy had grown up inside the old arithmetic of decisive battle. Distance was supposed to be a weapon. Attrition was supposed to be a weapon. Surprise, night attacks, long-range torpedoes, the careful bleeding of an approaching enemy line, all of it belonged to a world where a sunk hull remained absent. A battleship erased was an empty place in a formation. A cruiser burned at midnight was a gap that could not be closed before the next operation. The ocean was supposed to magnify loss. A nation that had to steam across the Pacific was supposed to feel every missing deck, every missing gun, every missing boiler like a tooth pulled from the jaw. That old logic made sense to men who had grown up with expensive fleets and long construction times. It made sense to officers who thought in squadrons in dry docks, in steel plates, hammered and riveted by craftsmen whose names were known to one another. It made sense to a Navy that believed it could cut America down to a manageable size before the final fleet action, sink enough ships on the way west, burn enough oil, kill enough trained crews, force the enemy into a negotiated peace before its material weight crossed the ocean. In that older world, victory came from subtraction. The American answer began before the shooting, and it did not begin with romance. It began with forms, boards, contracts, standard drawings, and the ugly humility of merchant hulls. In the late 1930s, the United States Maritime Commission pushed a long-range construction program built around standardized designs. In January of 1941, President Roosevelt announced 200 more ships beyond the original plan, and the annual output requirement climbed to 400 ships. The first Liberty ship, Patrick Henry, would be launched on September 27, 1941, at Baltimore. The design was simple on purpose, less elegant than more advanced plans, based on a British concept, built not to impress peacetime eyes, but to get steel afloat cheaply and quickly. The argument inside the program had been almost embarrassingly practical. Some worried such ships might be of little use after the war. But war has a way of humiliating refined objections. Need outweighed taste. Speed outweighed beauty. That was the first misunderstanding from the Japanese side. American shipbuilding was not merely large. It was deliberately unbeautiful in exactly the way war rewards. The Liberty ship was a blunt instrument given a keel. She was about 441 feet and 6 inches long, broad in the beam, slow, driven by a triple expansion steam engine that no one would have mistaken for the future. She moved at about 11 knots, carried roughly 10,800 deadweight tons, and looked, to men trained to admire warship lines, like a compromise piled upon a compromise. But simplicity was the point. Every plate that did not need to curve elegantly did not curve. Every part that could be standardized was standardized. The ship had been stripped of vanity until only tonnage remained. And then Henry J. Kaiser arrived with the manners of a man who had not been taught to fear old shipyard traditions. Kaiser was not born out of the old naval guilds. He came from great construction projects, from earth, concrete, schedules, and the habit of asking why a thing must be done the way it had always been done. That alone made him dangerous to older craftsmen and priceless to a nation suddenly trying to outbuild disaster. On the American West Coast, where no merchant vessels had been produced between 1929 and 1939, federal money and industrial urgency created something like a new industrial continent. During the war, the West Coast would turn out 52% of wartime ships. In the San Francisco Bay Area, shipyards launched more than 4,600 vessels, nearly 45% of all cargo tonnage and 1/5 of all warship tonnage, built in the United States during the conflict. The waterfront stopped being shoreline and became machinery. In Richmond, Kaiser's 4 yards spread along the water, not like workshops but like a city invented for steel. Numbered streets, lettered streets, long lanes for trucks and rail cars. Assembly areas large enough for sections of ships to lie on land, like pieces of another harbor waiting to be assembled. By late 1942, the Richmond complex had 27 graving basins and dry docks. Whirly cranes stood over the yard like giant insects, able to lift as much as 50 tons and swing it into place. Men who had grown up around older eastern yards would have recognized the labor, but not the geometry. This was horizontal, spacious, gridded, the logic of traffic flow applied to shipbuilding. The symbolic object in that world was not a medal or a flag. It was a stopwatch hung from a foreman's fingers while a section crossed open air. A stopwatch clicked as a welding crew climbed into place. A stopwatch lay on a desk beside coffee, gone cold while somebody checked whether a gang had beaten the previous shift on fitting a deckhouse. Time in older navies had been strategic, measured in steaming days and fuel consumption. Time in Richmond became mechanical and local, measured in minutes shaved from a lift, in hours saved by pre-assembly, in the rhythm between one crane horn and the next. What the Japanese Navy thought of as distance, the Americans were learning to break into tasks. Stand for a moment beside one seam in a Richmond yard, and the whole myth of war as maneuver begins to look incomplete. A prefabricated section has come in from the plant between shipyards number 3 and number 4, where whole pieces of ship structure are built away from the water. The section arrives with chalk marks, with edges already prepared, with men waiting before it touches down. The crane settles it with a shudder that runs through the soles of every boot nearby. There is the metallic cough of chain, the hollow drum of a plate making contact, shouted corrections, half lost under the yard noise. A foreman glancing at his stopwatch instead of up at the sky. Then welding arcs begin to snap alive. White blue light spits in hard bursts. Slag drops in orange tears, smoke curls and sticks under helmets. The air tastes bitter, mineral, electrical. Riveting had once meant gangs of specialists, a slower chain of effort. Noise that came in hard, hammering pulses. Welding turned seams into light. It also turned shipbuilding into something that could be broken down, taught faster, repeated more efficiently. That mattered because Kaiser's yards were filling with people who had not come up through generations of shipyard work. Women, African Americans, migrants from other states, workers who had never before held a torch over steel. From May of 1942 onward, Richmond adapted its methods to them, rather than waiting for the perfect labor force to appear. Downhand welding, considered the easiest position, opened the trade to new hands quickly. Narrow classifications multiplied. In boilermaking alone, there were more than 17 job classifications. A newcomer could move from trainee to journeyman in months instead of years. That was another thing the old naval mind did not quite know how to count. Japanese planners could count launched ships. They could count known shipyards. What was harder to count was the speed with which a nation could turn bus drivers, farm daughters, mechanics, draftsmen, and boys too young to remember the last shipbuilding boom into a labor force dense enough to make up its own weather. Kaiser's Richmond yards would eventually produce 747 ships, more than any shipyard complex in the country. Of those, 519 were Liberty ships, 142 were Victorials, the faster, stronger successors that followed later in the war. The rest included troop transports, frigates, tank landing ships, and smaller utility hulls. The numbers matter, but the physical repetition matters more. 747 times. A keel had to be laid, or a section lifted, or a seam closed, or paint blown through a hose, or a pipe aligned by hands that smelled of oil and rust. 747 times. Some exhausted worker had to climb down from steel at the end of a shift, with ears ringing and shoulders numb, and go home to a city improvising housing, transport, food lines, childcare, and sleep around the requirements of the yard. Japanese officers could understand courage. They could understand discipline. They could understand tactical shock. What became harder to understand was monotony weaponized on this scale. How do you explain a country that answers a sinking not with mourning alone, not even with rage alone, but with more welding masks, more sectional fabrication, more dry dock schedules, more rail deliveries, more night shifts, more coffee, more chalk marks, more stopwatches? The answer was not only new ships, it was also that many American ships refused to stay dead. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The old world of naval logic should have been confirmed there in fire. Battleships were burning in place. Men were trapped below decks. Fuel burned on water. Steel was twisted, flooded, scorched, and blackened with human smoke. If ever a fleet had been shattered, in a way that should have created permanent absence, it was that morning. Yet one of the men who mattered most afterward was not a glamorous combat commander. It was Captain Homer N. Wallen, placed into full-time work as fleet salvage officer. The official account later called the salvage operation a mammoth undertaking. That phrase is almost too clean for what the work actually was. Salvage begins in ugliness, not in banners, not in speeches. In Pearl Harbor, Wallen's crews had to free trapped men, recover ordnance, provide medical help, clean compartments, and work inside ships that were still dangerous in ways no battlefield map captures well. There was deadly gas in compartments. There were gasoline explosions. There were fire hazards everywhere. There was a shortage of material. There were bodies to remove. Machinery had to be cleaned, dried, tested, patched, coaxed. Spaces filled with black water had to be entered by men who could not know exactly what would ignite, collapse, or poison them. Picture Wallen not as an abstract administrator, but as a man moving through that harbor after the shock, where the air held fuel, wet ash, and the sweet sick note of burned insulation. Picture a lantern beam passing over a bulkhead streaked with oil. Picture a hand touching steel to judge heat. Picture a pencil or chalk marking a cut line where metal must be opened. Picture a watch consulted because pumps cannot run on hope. He and the yard did not resurrect ships by declaring them symbolically alive. They resurrected them by reopening systems one valve, one wire, one compartment at a time. They restored unwatered compartments and machinery. They dealt with electric drive systems and wrecked structure while the war kept moving. Most of the broken Pearl Harbor fleet that could be brought back was brought back. Pennsylvania, Helena, Maryland, Tennessee, Nevada, California, West Virginia. More than that, even ships sunk or savaged in ways that should have made them museum pieces instead of fighting units were rehabilitated for war. The attack that the Japanese had intended as a strategic amputation became in part an industrial injury. The difference is enormous. An amputation changes the body forever. An industrial injury sends the body to the yard. And because Wallen's world was linked to Kaiser's world, repair and replacement began to merge. New sections could be imagined. Old damage could be cut away. The American war at sea was no longer only about keeping ships afloat. It was about keeping hull numbers from becoming final verdicts. The same pattern surfaced again and again in combat. When the heavy cruiser New Orleans was torpedoed in the night battle off Tassafaronga, the blast tore away nearly 1/3 of the ship, including the bow. In older arithmetic, that should have been the end of her as an effective fighting unit. Yet the crew carried out temporary repairs at Tulagi. The ship then backed more than 1,000 miles to Sydney, Australia. A temporary bow was installed there, and later, at Puget Sound, a new bow was fitted and all battle damage repaired before the cruiser returned to service. A Japanese torpedo attack had not merely damaged American metal. It had triggered a chain of work spread across islands, dockyards, workshops, railheads, and industrial schedules. The torpedo had to be paid for twice, once in the immediate tactical result, and then again in the American ability to turn damage into another lesson in procedure. That is what made the war so demoralizing from the Japanese side once the opening shocks passed. Tactical success remained real. Ships were sunk, carriers were destroyed, cruisers were torn apart, transports burned. Men died in freezing water or under tropical sky. None of that is illusion. But the strategic meaning of a sinking depends on what the enemy can do next. The Imperial Japanese Navy had prepared itself to win by attrition before decisive battle. The Americans kept changing what attrition meant. By the middle years of the war, the stopwatches in American yards were linked to every ocean in a way impossible to see from a single bridge. A Liberty ship did not have to be magnificent. She only had to arrive. She carried ammunition, trucks, spare parts, food, tanks, fuel drums, bridge sections, locomotives in pieces, medical supplies, flour, canned meat, mail, bulldozers, rope, wire, replacement aircraft in crates, even the boring, unheroic hardware without which armies become stranded crowds. Japanese planners who imagined a fleet war of battle lines and carriers were increasingly confronted by a thicker reality. They were not fighting only the ships they could identify on recognition cards. They were fighting the traffic behind them. The scale became almost indecent. Between 1939 and 1945, the Maritime Commission built 5,171 ships of over 2,000 gross registered tons. Between 1941 and 1946, the Maritime Commission and the War Shipping Administration managed what official history called the greatest industrial shipbuilding and ship operations effort ever seen, constructing nearly 6,000 merchant vessels and naval auxiliaries whilst simultaneously operating, repairing, and maintaining thousands of ships. By the end of the war, the United States would operate nearly 2/3 of the world's shipping. Those are not just statistics. They are pressure. They are the feeling, from the losing side, that the ocean has stopped obeying distance. Imagine how this looked from a Japanese operational map room after the first year of war. Sinkings are entered. Estimated losses are entered. A convoy report arrives saying fresh American tonnage has been sighted. Carrier forces reappear. Damaged units thought out of action return. New hulls show up with names no one has memorized because there is no time to memorize them all. Merchant traffic keeps moving. The enemy does not behave like a fleet that has accepted subtraction. It behaves like an industrial reservoir. There is a particular cruelty in that. Courage can answer courage. Skill can answer skill. Even numbers, up to a point, can be emotionally managed by a professional officer corps. But replacement at industrial speed attacks something more private: confidence in causality itself. A sailor wants to believe that if he risks his life to sink a ship, that act alters the future in a visible proportion. Yet American industrial power kept blurring that proportion. Japanese torpedo crews and submarine commanders did not become less dangerous. They became trapped in a war where destruction no longer guaranteed absence. Henry Kaiser's achievement is often reduced to a trick of speed, to the famous launches, the astonishment of ships built in weeks, and sometimes under choreographed conditions in mere days. But the deeper transformation lay in how he and the wider American shipbuilding effort changed the social composition of production. A pre-war nation that had tolerated dormant yards and modest merchant output turned waterfronts into engines. Support systems grew around the work, because the work could not wait for society to become tidy first. Housing had to appear. Transportation had to function. Medical care had to follow the shifts. Child care had to become part of wartime logistics, whether politicians liked the idea or not. The yard was not only a place where ships were built, it was a place that forced an entire civilian environment to serve production. Step back into Richmond on a cold morning and look carefully at what that meant in physical terms. Before dawn, the yard is already alive with movement. Headlights slide along wet pavement. Lunch buckets knock against knees. Somebody coughs into the harbor damp. A train shoves material in. A crane light swings in the mist. The steel itself carries the night chill so sharply it stings through gloves. Then the day begins in sections. Not a ship, in the romantic singular. A bottom section, a boiler space, a forepeak, a deckhouse, a hatch combing. The whirly crane lifts, men guide, sparks spit. A horn sounds from somewhere unseen. Puddles tremble under a heavy movement overhead. Every part of the yard is working on a future ship that does not yet exist whole in any single place. The genius of prefabrication is that it allows a vessel to be born everywhere at once. A Japanese officer thinking in traditional launch schedules sees one ship. Richmond sees 1,000 tasks converging. And while that work goes on, Wallen's kind of work continues elsewhere. Damaged ships reach repair facilities. Navy yards strip and rebuild. Floating dry docks receive vessels that would once have had to crawl home, if they survived at all. Emergency repairs become standard skill. The American answer to loss is therefore two-handed. One hand keeps laying keels. The other hand refuses to abandon damaged hulls that can still be pulled back into usefulness. The result is more than replacement. It is denial of enemy finality. For the Japanese, whose own war economy had far less depth and far less fuel margin, the contrast became intolerable. The blockade tightened. Shipping losses mounted. The nation that had expected to thin an American advance began to watch its own maritime arteries cut apart. Official post-war analysis described how the blockade prevented Japan from exploiting conquered resources, kept the economy off balance, created material shortages that limited war production, and deprived the country of oil in amounts sufficient to immobilize fleet and air units, and impair training. Transportation, the report said, faced insurmountable difficulties because of fuel shortages, enemy attacks on lines of communication, and insufficient manpower in cargo handling. That sentence is the sound of a modern war machine beginning to suffocate. On the American side, abundance meant more than food and fuel. It meant margin. Margin for mistakes, margin for losses, margin for experiments, margin to build ugly ships because elegant ones were not required for every task, margin to repair vessels under terrible conditions, margin to replace not only hulls but habits. On the Japanese side, every shortage narrowed choice. Fuel shortage narrowed training. Material shortage narrowed repair. Shipping loss narrowed industry. Industry narrowed fleet operations. Fleet immobility narrowed strategy until strategy began to resemble waiting. The emotional contrast is essential. Japanese naval doctrine assumed that war at sea would still be governed by the old prestige of major units and decisive encounters. American reality turned war at sea into an argument about whether a society could keep steel moving faster than a navy could sink it. To the Japanese, a battle was supposed to reveal superiority. To the Americans, battle increasingly became only one moment in a longer chain that began in a drawing, office, and ended in a shipyard whistle. You can see the collision of those two worlds most clearly in the middle of the war, after the first great carrier clashes had stripped away illusion. But before total collapse made everything obvious. The Japanese still had lethality. Night torpedo tactics remained savage. Airstrikes could still maul American forces. Submarines still found targets. But every tactical success now ran into a nation that had already begun to industrialize its own emotional response. There would be grief. There would be casualty lists. There would be charred photographs and letters folded into uniforms that never came home. Yet at the same time, there would be another hull at Baltimore, another hull at Richmond, another hull at Los Angeles, another repair at Pearl, another temporary patch at some remote anchorage, another set of boilers lowered into another cargo ship, Industrial war is cruel not only because it kills. It is cruel because it turns mourning into scheduling. By late war, the asymmetry was complete. The Americans were mining sea routes, striking ports, and choking Japan's home waters. The official record later noted that aerial mining by B-29 bombers in the last months of the war sealed off the vital inland sea and disrupted every major home island port. By July of 1945, what remained of the Imperial Japanese Navy was immobilized in port because of lack of fuel and critical maintenance. The phrase is devastating in its plainness. Critical maintenance. Not glorious defeat in battle. Not a final Trafalgar. Maintenance. Bearings that cannot be replaced. Systems that cannot be serviced. Hulls that cannot be properly tended because the larger body feeding them has been starved. Then the figures become almost Morgue-like. Out of 25 Japanese aircraft carriers and escort carriers, only 5 were still afloat, all damaged. Of 12 battleships, only Nagato remained afloat. Of 18 heavy cruisers, only 2, both badly damaged, remained at Singapore. Of 22 light cruisers, only 2 survived. Of 177 destroyers, only 5 remained. Across the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost 334 warships out of 611 total vessels, along with just over 300,000 men. More than 2,000 Japanese merchant ships were sunk. Tens of thousands of merchant crewmen were gone with them. That final paralysis was not caused by one battle alone. It was the culmination of a deeper mismatch. Japan could kill ships. It could not solve the American habit of making new ones and reviving old ones at a rate that changed the meaning of loss. The Japanese could count American sinkings, but they could not make those sinkings stay proportionate in the face of American production. They could win terrible nights and still lose the calendar, return how to Richmond, because all the abstraction becomes clear there. The Robert E. Peary sliding down the ways in less than 5 days was a stunt in one sense, a carefully organized display of what the system could do under ideal conditions. But stunts matter in war when they reveal genuine capacity. The point was not that every ship would be launched in that time. The point was that the old assumptions about what shipbuilding was and how long it must take had been broken in public. A full cargo ship had entered the water while the rest of the world was still thinking in peacetime durations. Applause on the pier was the sound of time itself being seized as a weapon, and beneath that dramatic moment there was always the ordinary labor. A welder's shoulder gone tight under a heavy hood, a rigger's hand burned through a glove, a draftsman's eraser crumbs on a table, a crane operator leaning forward in the cab, peering through glass blurred by mist and grime, men and women walking home with steel dust in their cuffs, night shifts chewing sandwiches under floodlights while the harbor wind cut through sweat-stiffened jackets. Nobody in those moments looked like the abstract noun history later prefers. They looked tired. They looked irritated. They looked half-frozen or sweat-soaked. They looked like workers inside a machine that was larger than patriotism, yet inseparable from it. Homer Wallen's men, too, lived inside that same anonymity. The salvage diver climbing down into a fouled space under Pearl Harbor water. The repair party running hoses through a compartment slick with fuel. The men who dried electrical systems, cleaned machinery, checked pumps, opened wrecked sections, and tried to make dead circuits carry life again. Their contribution was easy to miss because successful repair erases the spectacle of damage. A ship that returns to service no longer appears as a ruin. The ruin disappears inside the recommissioned hull. But to the Japanese side, every returned ship was a wound that had refused to remain visible. That is a uniquely frustrating kind of enemy. Yamamoto never lived to see the full depth of the industrial answer that had already begun to ruin the doctrine he trusted. Yet the war he designed was haunted by the flaw from the beginning. It rested on an inaccurate understanding of American intent and of what American society could do once properly mobilized. He understood risk, surprise, and fleet maneuver brilliantly. What he could not master was the American capacity to turn a civilian continent into maritime throughput. The decisive battle tradition had assumed that destruction would speak for itself. American industry kept interrupting the sentence. By the end, the stopwatches on the American side and the immobilized hulls on the Japanese side belonged to the same story. One side had learned to divide enormous tasks into hundreds of smaller tasks and then flood them with labor, steel, and time discipline. The other side increasingly lacked the oil, repair margin, shipping safety, and industrial elasticity needed to recover from cumulative damage. One side grew more impersonal and therefore more resilient. The other remained deadly but brittle. There is a final image worth holding, not a battle line, not a carrier exploding, not even a torpedo wake. Imagine instead a quiet harbor in Japan in the summer of 1945. Warships are present, yet absent in spirit. They float, but they do not move. Paint weathers, rust streaks lengthen, lines groan softly. Men aboard feel the humiliation of idleness more sharply than the fear of battle. Fuel is short, maintenance is overdue. The sea, once the great stage of imperial confidence, has become a barrier around a fleet that cannot properly sail. Now cut back, one last time, to Richmond. Another shift change, another crane rolling. Another hull section hanging over the yard, with rainwater dripping from its underside. Somewhere a foreman closes the lid of a stopwatch with a metallic click and slips it into his pocket before calling for the next lift. That little object, mundane and almost laughable beside a warship's guns, explains more than any sinking report. The Japanese could explain bravery. They could explain torpedo performance. They could explain night fighting, surprise, discipline, sacrifice. What they could not explain was a nation that answered the ocean with timetables, prefabrication, repair gangs, and the stubborn refusal to let absence stay absent. So when American sailors later looked at the names of ships lost and ships returned, and when Japanese officers later looked at the wreckage of their own immobilized fleet, the truth was lying there in plain sight, small enough to fit in a palm, not a sword, not a flag, not even a shell casing, a stopwatch ticking over wet steel, while another ship came down the ways and the watch was